So international liberalism is often juxtaposed with realism, just because if realism holds that people are sort of inherently competitive and always looking to stab each other in the back, liberalism holds that people are inherently cooperative and will always cooperate if you give them the opportunity and the correct conditions. And so it really comes down, and so like we hold a lot of the same assumptions between realism and liberalism. Things like the international system is anarchy. Liberalism thinks that's true also, but that there are different ways to manage that anarchy rather than it just being like a question of deterrence, power balancing, etc. Liberals don't think that we have like no use for those concepts, but just that there are better ways. One of the sort of core assumptions of realism is that war is inevitable, and liberals don't think that that's true. They think that it is possible to create a world without war, provided we have the right structures. And so one of the ways that we do this is by focusing on individual rights. And so individual rights, as far as the liberal worldview is concerned, ought to be the highest form of governance. This is obviously a little bit different than, say, our buddies like in the realist camp, where just like morality is at best weakness. It's sort of the opposite of that take. And so here is where we get organizations that are concerned first and foremost with protecting the rights of individual people. And so then we have to construct these institutions. And usually these institutions are interested in specifically promoting things like free and fair elections. The idea is that in a democracy with free and fair elections, the people can assert their will, and so their rights are far more likely to be protected than under any other system where the people cannot assert their will. So we're always looking to implement that sort of democracy, promote that democracy. And military power gets kind of concerning for liberals. Because I think that military power is important, just because like if your neighbor is going to try to take away the rights of your citizens, you have to have enough military power to stop them. But if you're going to use that military power to take away the rights of your own citizens, then we run into some issues, some problems. And so it's a really complicated question for liberals. And so that's one of the reasons that they think that democracy is a good way to do things. Because hypothetically democracy is the best way to make sure that the military is only ever used to defend the people instead of to oppress the people. And one of the things that liberalism is really interested in is stopping the sort of imperial and expansionist wars that were really frequent, especially prior to World War I, but even before World War II, kind of into the Cold War a little bit. But yeah, because like liberalism is the sort of IR movement that ends up being used to force countries like France to give up colonial holdings, that kind of stuff. And so liberalism is then trying to limit these imperial and expansionist wars because they think that they will always infringe on people's liberties. And so one of the things that you need for that is you need to have like a bureaucracy that has an interest in maintaining its own power so that a foreign power trying to take over is like unacceptable. And so this is where we get the promotion of nationalism.
This is a bureaucracy for the
individual country.
Okay.
Individual country. So like India is a common example that's used here. The promotion of Hindu nationalism in India is something that is often very acceptable for liberals because it helps create sort of like a cohesive Indian identity and a way that India can kind of define itself against foreign actors, particularly, you know, the former British colonizers, and ensure that like they are unwilling to tolerate any kind of interlopers from former colonial powers. Now that is not to say that nationalism is without problems. We are most familiar with those problems in an American context, just because nationalism in an American context often looks like imperialism and white supremacy. But it's been a problem in lots of places. If we look at Hindu nationalism in India, it's been used to oppress Muslims. If we look at like Buddhist nationalism in Myanmar, it's been used to oppress Muslims. Really, it's Muslims a lot, actually. But yeah. So nationalism is not without its own problems, but it is often a key portion of former colonies creating their own identity and their own characteristics separate from their former colonizers. Now, one of the main things that we use from liberalism in debate is democratic peace theory. So democratic peace theory originally held that like democracies are just less likely to go to war. These days we more say democracies are less likely to go to war with one another. And there are a couple of reasons for this. Now, liberals believe that democracies just have more checks against going to war. So, for example, Biden cannot just go to war with Russia. He can't actually even declare war. He doesn't have the power to do that. Who has the power to declare war?
The Congress.
Congress, yes, absolutely. Biden is the commander-in-chief, and so he can do things like work with intelligence agencies to try and assist Ukrainian troops in a variety of ways, but he cannot actually go to war with Russia without Congress's permission. And so that is an inherent check on his power. Now, there are also less formal checks, and so one of the things that was overwhelmingly polled after Russia invaded Ukraine was that it would be very politically unpopular for the United States to go to war with Russia. Like, Americans were very against sending troops or like people of any kind to Ukraine after it was invaded. And so that's a less formal but still very strict check on the actions of democratic leaders. You have to get reelected. If you do a bunch of stuff that the people don't like, you won't get reelected. You know, hypothetically. That is how democracy should work. And so that then creates additional checks that say an authoritarian government might not have. If the Prince of Saudi Arabia wants to go to war, who is going to stop him?
Not very many.
His papa?
Possibly? Nobody, yeah. There's no like war council, like there is a war council to like advise him, but they like can't stop him from doing it. There's no parliament, there's no Congress.
And he's like, oh well.
But yes, so the argument is then that authoritarians and or monarchs have no check on their power. So they can just kind of do whatever they want, which means that you are always at the whims of the individual, and they're far more likely to go to war in that scenario. Whereas in a democracy, even if the leader of the country does want to go to war, that may not be doable or tenable for them for a variety of reasons. Either very formal structural ones, like checks and balances, or just political ones that are still very serious, like restrictions. Now, one of the other things that we sort of realized over time is that democracies then tend to see each other as more legitimate actors than they see authoritarian governments. And so this is one of the reasons why like a free functioning democracy is sort of a prerequisite for countries to be accepted into NATO, is because democracies just see each other as more legitimate like powers. And there are a variety of explanations for why this is true. Liberalism doesn't really have any of them, just because like liberalism is less concerned with like the ideology of democracy and more concerned with the direct ramifications. That's why it exists kind of over on our more interpretive side, or excuse me, our more objective side of theories. They're less interested in the why and more interested in the what. What is happening? And how can we use what is happening, how can we use the patterns that we see to then predict the future behavior of states? Now, one of the things that this does mean is that democracies tend to see authoritarians as less legitimate leaders. Which can actually cause them to be more likely to go to war with non-democracies. And so we see this repeatedly, especially when we take joint action with other democracies in places like Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya. And so like this is a repeat like pattern at this point. The early days of democratic peace theory were like, no, that would absolutely never happen, that's a ridiculous claim, there's too many checks on war. But when the populace in general has a sort of ideology that anything other than democracy makes a country illegitimate, then violating that country's sovereignty is no longer like a bad thing. It's seen as important, as necessary, because the leader is a tyrant who is oppressing their people. Now, real quick, what is sovereignty?
So, a country, if it has sovereignty, or is seen as having sovereignty, under sovereignty, I'm really good at words, is like, has the ability to do what it wants without getting interfered in.
Basically, yeah. It's just like, I have control over my own borders and my own space. And so, the violation of sovereignty is considered very serious, especially under sort of the liberal world order. We'll talk about what exactly I mean by liberal world order here in a second. But as realists would point out, this often is only in respect to how powerful a given country is. And so the US violates Pakistan's sovereignty all the time by just like flying drones in their airspace without telling them, or conducting raids to kill Osama bin Laden without telling them. And that is a definitive and obvious violation of their sovereignty. If Pakistan were to try to do the same thing, there would be very serious consequences for that. And thus they would never try. And so one of the things that I often find with both realism and liberalism is both have interesting ideas that are often necessary to paint a full picture, but they are technically distinct and conflicting theories of international relations just because their core assumptions are so divergent from one another. Now, once we get into the critical theory side of things, that's where we get into like the really serious disagreement with both realism and liberalism. Just because like realism and liberalism both sort of exist on our more like objective side of the spectrum. They both often value the exact same data. They just interpret it in very different ways most of the time. Whereas when we get over into the more interpretive side of theory, then a lot of it's like, no, throw the baby out with the bathwater. It's all bad. We hate it.
I do this a lot.
So the liberal world order is just like a turn of phrase that's used to refer to the structure of international relations basically after World War II. And so like sometimes there's like a bunch of different words that people will use. Mostly people have settled on liberal world order. And the primary reason that this is when we start thinking of the world as liberally ordered is because it's when we get the United Nations. This is when we get a sort of, let's say charitably universal goal of limiting violent conflict and violent state action. After 2 world wars, pretty much everybody was like, let's never do that again. That was awful. How about we not? Especially since like they happened within like a couple decades of each other. And so like basically from like the 1920s to like the mid-1940s, the world was like just losing like a third of its population all the time. It was like bad. And so people were like, let's not. And so this is when you get the United Nations. Now, the United Nations predecessor, the League of Nations, was an attempt by President Woodrow Wilson to bring about a sort of liberal world order. Because Europe was absolutely devastated after World War I. And so Wilson saw this as an opportunity to say, you know, cement a little US hegemony. But also to say, okay, we clearly need some sort of like Council of Nations, or League of Nations, if you will, where we can all get together and, you know, talk it out instead of like fighting each other about it. The problem was, Wilson was very particular in who he included in his little League of Nations. It was only European countries, and one of those countries was not Germany. And so, like, the League of Nations mostly just told Germany what to do. Does anybody remember the sort of aftermath of World War I? What caused Germany's economic crisis?
So we the League, the League asked Germany to pay a whole bunch of reparations payments, and then at some point when Germany was like really booming in the Berlin times, I think, France came in and came knocking and was like, hey, give us that money. And so they called up the US to get a bunch of loans. Okay, maybe the Berlin Times happened afterwards. But then the US stock market crashed, so the US bank was like, hey Germany, remember that money that you got to pay off the money that France wanted? Well, can you give us that money? And they didn't have that money.
Yes.
And then hyperinflation.
Yes. People demanded reparations for the damage that Germany caused during World War I, and it was an egregious sum, like an unpayable sum from jump. And so this then led to massive economic collapse of Germany, and like ongoing economic issues that gave rise to what we would today call fascism, but at the time just kind of looked like some good old-fashioned German nationalism. And so this is also one of the ways that nationalism can get dicey, and so is a tool that we have to be very careful about using.
Oh wait, this was before World War II. It's caused World War II. Yes, I remember.
Yes, this is what caused World War II.
Berlin was after World War II. Yeah.
I meant the good Berlin. Like the German golden age, but not called that. The good times.
Let's put a pin in that for another time. But yes. And so then, after World War II, people were like, okay, this league thing really didn't work. If this is going to work, we need every single country involved. And that is why anybody who is recognized as a state gets to be part of the United Nations. Now, the UN does have this fancy thing called the UN Security Council. And the UN Security Council is a small group of 10 actors that get to veto certain UN actions. Now there are 5 rotating members of the UN Security Council, but there are also 5 permanent members. Does anybody know who the 5 permanent members are?
US,
Russia.
China, Russia.
US, China, Russia.
No. Japan? France.
France.
Wow,
England,
really?
UK.
France?
UK.
Yeah.
So the United Kingdom, the United Kingdom, the United States, France, Russia, China. Those are your 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council.
Can you repeat that one more time, please?
The United States, the United Kingdom, France, China, and Russia.
Sorry, I forgot about France. Thank you.
I like France is that important. I did not know that.
So yeah, France was like a big empire back in the day.
That's what he was
And
I
so
mean, like now.
No.
that's sort of why they maintain relevance, is because they were such a large empire for so long. It's one of the ways that people point out that colonialism still has a lot of modern effects, even if countries aren't like, you know, colonized in name these days. And so,
How long would they be in there?
A while.
a hot minute, like, whoa,
I thought it was just like
400
Napoleon.
years?
Wait, but then there was Napoleon the Second and the Third, and then like
And like,
Charles
they
de
never really
Gaulle.
lost any of those holdings until after World War II. Like, the loss of French holdings in a lot of East Asia is what caused a lot of those conflicts during the Cold War. Because there were like massive power grabs because nobody was interested in actually maintaining stability in any of those places. Shocker. But yes, and so that is why the United Nations is like, yes, we have, like, everybody gets to be a member, and that's why there are 5 rotating members of the Security Council to make sure that like everybody gets like that very high position at some point. But, you know, it is still like, yeah, but there are still 5 countries that we think like really matter, you know.
Who are the 5 rotating ones currently, do you know?
Currently, I don't know, no.
So where is the 5 rotating members?
Just to give other people a seat on the veto power board, basically. Because like that is one of the things that that prevented the United Nations from acting throughout most of the Cold War. Is any action that was proposed was viewed as either deleterious to the United States or the USSR, and so they were all just vetoed by one or the other. But hypothetically, that was a good thing. Maybe it stopped an actual war between the US and the USSR. Who knows? Liberals would argue it definitely did. But the organization...
So like the UN.
Yes, liberals
because
love the
of
UN.
all-
Yes.
Because it promotes war and stuff.
Liberals love the UN, and they actually even love NATO, which is interesting because NATO is a security alliance. But they think that those security alliances are good. That generally the existence of these alliances stops violent conflict. Because like, why would I mess with France if I know that like the US, Canada, the UK, and like a whole bunch of other people are then gonna come get me? I would not mess with France anymore. And so that's one of the reasons that liberals like alliances, even if they are actual security alliances. But the organization that liberals probably point to the most as like emblematic of their ideals is the European Union. And so the European Union is one of the only organizations in the world that actually, like, countries cede their own sovereignty in order to be part of it. Like, the United Nations can pass resolutions and they can take joint actions. Like, if the United Nations were to be like, hey, United States, you have to pass a law that says everybody has a right to an abortion, we'd be like, no, we don't. There's literally nothing in the UN Charter that would indicate that at all. That's hilarious. Whereas, like, the European Union does have those kinds of powers. Now, these are things that are, like, voted on by member states, and there are a whole bunch of, like, legislative processes. But it means that when the EU says something, you have to do it. It's why there's, that's why there are soft borders all throughout the European Union, because it's all one passport. It's all one currency. They're like, each country still maintains their own individual currency to, like, some degree. Usually, though, that's more of, like, a touristy thing than anything else. Like, you'll get tourists that just, like, go backpacking around Europe and are like, do you have any francs in your cash register? And you're like, no. Go to a bank. Jesus Christ. But yes, it's one of the reasons that we can have, like, this sort of relationship that, like, states in the United States have, but between, like, actual countries in Europe. And so then, one of the biggest goals of liberalism is the spread of free market capitalism. Because their opinion, generally speaking, the sort of liberal consensus, is that free market capitalism is the best way to protect individual rights because it offers individuals the most freedom. That is up for debate. But that is the current liberal stance on free market capitalism. Is this probably influenced by countries in the West? Like, I don't know, the United States? Yeah, maybe a little bit. But again, liberals are less concerned with examining the source of their ideology and more concerned with seeing its output.
Why do they, sorry I missed it, why do they say that free market capitalism is the best way to?
Because it allows for the most individual freedom.
Okay.
Yeah. I would argue it allows global powers the most access to markets in developing countries, but neither here nor there as far as the liberals are concerned. And so generally speaking, organizations like the United Nations, the European Union, etc., have the goal of promoting like democracy, cooperation, human rights, etc. Now, liberalism is distinct from the neoliberalism that we are used to talking about in debate. Neoliberalism is technically an economic system that's characterized by the privatization of state-run services, or formerly state-run services. And so the American healthcare system is a great example of this. In most other developed countries, you have some sort of state-run healthcare system. That looks very different from country to country, but that's one of the things. So the sort of age of neoliberalism is often the 1980s, when Reagan and Thatcher were doing a whole bunch of privatization of what were formerly state-run services. And so Thatcher tried to dismantle the healthcare system that exists in the UK. She was unsuccessful, and trying to do the same thing almost got Boris Johnson effectively impeached. The parliamentary equivalent. Not literally, there's a parliamentary equivalent that's not impeachment per se, but it's yeah, we're gonna yoink you from office if you try to do this again. But the electric systems here in the United States are privatized. Those used to be state-run systems. Some highway systems have become privatized. There's talks about privatizing the TSA. Water services are privatized, these sorts of things.
How would we prioritize the TSA?
Yeah, they're just what we should do is we should have a corporation that brings in airport cops that do all the checking, because TSA is bad at their jobs.
Ooh.
But
yeah.
I don't get it. What?
Yeah, UPS and FedEx are also great examples of neoliberalism. Previously, the mail was a solely state-run service, but it was through the advent of neoliberalism that we decided, well, the state's just bad at stuff. So it should not do things. We should let private corporations do things. Free markets, yeah.
So USPS is the state-run service, and then FedEx is obviously not.
Exactly,
Solid.
exactly.
I almost hit a FedEx truck because it didn't have its headlights on and it was pitch black outside.
Anyway, in an international relations context, what this usually ends up meaning
That's really
It blended in with the dark. There were no lights on.
is that the goal is then, people think that neoliberalism encourages or incentivizes cooperation. That way, we can all get the most bang for our buck. Because one of the ways that liberalism, again, sharply diverges from realism is this idea of absolute gains. So one of the things we talked about when we talked about realism was the idea that power, especially hegemony, is zero-sum. Liberalism does not view really anything this way. So a realist would say, well, if somebody else takes a bigger piece of the pie, that de facto means we are getting a smaller piece of the pie. Whereas neoliberalism is nah, dog, we can just always make more pie. It's fine. And so somebody else's gain is not necessarily viewed as somebody else's loss. And so a country growing their GDP is not inherently threatening because it doesn't affect you. Chill, kind of thing. We can both grow our GDPs. It'll be fine. And one of the things that I think is particularly interesting, and that a lot of critics of liberalism have, is that liberalism is often just imperialism with a bow on it. It just becomes the nicer version of imperial conquest. So organizations like the IMF or the World Bank, which are these organizations that are hypothetically supposed to transport a bunch of capital into formerly colonized nations to help reduce instances of poverty, violence, etc. And they often just end up exploiting those countries. And so the US's own foreign policy is also an interesting sort of example of this, where we see that the United States foreign policy could be characterized as liberal in many ways, most ways. The goal is democracy promotion, the goal is the spread of free market capitalism, etc. But oftentimes what that requires, that spread of democracy and free market capitalism, requires imperial action. Because countries are what if we don't want those things? And the US is well, too bad, they're good for you. And so then this gets us into the question of, is it possible to be a liberal world power without being an imperialist? And so if you're asking, say, a Marxist or a post-colonialist, they would say no, that liberalism is just imperialism 2.0, and that it's just the new way that the imperial core has found to exploit the global south. Now, if you are a believer in liberal norms and that liberal politics has the ability to do things like protect individual rights, you would obviously dispute this argument and be no, just because you have found some examples where it went poorly does not mean it could not go well. In fact, we have a lot of examples where it went very well, i.e. the European Union. And so this then becomes like a question that won't be settled in the grand scheme of things at any time. But if you are looking for K-links to affirmatives this year, this is the goal. Characterizing the AF as like a liberal mode of imperialism will be the goal. And this needs to be part of your explanation when you are explaining why reforms are not possible. Because obviously if you're going for a critique, one of your arguments will be that the state is doing a bad and will always do a bad. And so no, we cannot make reforms through the state. Or at least the reforms that you've chosen are extra bad. Whereas the affirmative needs to win the argument that reforms are good and possible, and we are a good example of reform. We are an example of progress, of good change. This is sometimes viewed as the linear progress narrative. Now this is something that a lot of people will critique liberals for. This is something that's interesting because fascists and Marxists both agree on this critique of liberalism, that it has this sort of linear narrative of progress, that everything throughout human history has just gotten a little bit better over time. And so everything today is much better than it was 20 years ago, or something like that, or 10 years ago, or whatever. And so fascists would be no, have you seen all of the identity politics, and now black people think they get rights? Gross. Whereas Marxists would be well, no, actually, because now we're still serfs on the manor. It's just called capitalism instead of feudalism. That's not better. And so, the critical theorists have similar arguments. One of a famous critical theorist called Foucault, who some of you might be familiar with from last year's topic, was really big on no, our mental health care facilities are actually worse than they used to be. The way that we treat people with neurodivergencies or disabilities is worse actually than it used to be even say 300 or 400 years ago, when those people were viewed as prophets of God or what have you, or connected to the spirits in some way. And so the linear progression of society is something that liberals very much believe in, and that everybody else is kind of I don't know.
I'd love to be called a prophet.
That was mostly people with seizures.
Wait, we used to actually call them prophets instead of trying to exercise them?
Yes. Especially when you get outside of the West, yeah, you get into a lot, the global South especially, you get a lot of they're connected to the spiritual land in a more profound way than the rest of us are.
Again, why didn't Hawaii do colonialism instead of
And that's not to say that those traditions didn't exist anywhere in the West. One of the things that's really tragic is the amount of Celtic history that we've lost to Christianization. Because we don't know what the Celts thought about a lot of things, because it's just gone, burned up and or unrecognizable. One of the things that we find when missionaries tend to go and Christianize canons, especially unwritten canons, the Celts and the Vikings are the two most common examples here, is for a long time, priests were just Loki's the devil, obviously. And it's no, that doesn't make any sense! What are you talking about? Yeah, Odin is basically just their version of God, Thor is Jesus, and Loki is Satan. Boom! We figured it out! It's no! And so it becomes very difficult for us to say which traditions did or did not have some of these characteristics, which people who are critiquing liberalism would argue is liberalism's fault, or at least precursors of liberalism. So, on this particular topic, as we've alluded to many times, the affirmative has to have a defense of liberalism. You're NATO is sick and we should make them better. Or NATO is not as good as it should be and we should make them better. You don't have to take the stance that NATO is inherently good or has done only good things, obviously. But your goal is to make NATO a more effective organization, a more effective security alliance. And so, at the core, that is a liberal argument. Now, what we'll see a lot is that the impact scenarios that affirmatives have, so yes, Russia and China are revisionist, or yes, Russia-China war, that sort of stuff. Or yes, proliferation, perhaps. Those are all sort of realist arguments, and one of the reasons that they tend to work well, even in this sort of more liberal theory of international relations, is that liberals do agree that the international system as we know it is anarchy. They just disagree that that's inevitable, or that that's unfixable. And so their argument for realists is often yeah, I get that that's the way things are, and I don't think you're necessarily wrong about that. The problem is you think that we can't ever change that about our society or our world. And so yeah, if we don't have organizations like the UN, like NATO, like the European Union, like the African Union, like ASON, etc., we don't have these organizations, yeah, it will be anarchy, and it will be power balancing, it will be power grabbing. However, if we can just work together, then we can solve all of those problems. But if we don't work together, those problems will absolutely happen. And so when you are cutting your K-links for this year, one of the things that you're going to be looking for, ideally you are looking for like actual links about like data, AI, cybersecurity, biotech, and the way that those things are used in the context of your specific literature base. And so if I was going to cut a colonialism critique for this year, I would absolutely be looking into vaccine diplomacy and the way that vaccine diplomacy is used to sort of what's called manufactured consent in that literature base. Where basically,
Didn't everyone's like inject a bunch of people with fake vaccines?
yeah, that's what happened in Pakistan when we were looking for Osama bin Laden. We were looking for DNA that was shared. Basically, we had a sample of Osama bin Laden's DNA, and we were looking for people that shared a lot of the DNA, i.e. like family members. And the way that we got those blood samples was we gave people, I think the vaccines were real, if I remember right. I think they did actually vaccinate people. I can't remember what it was for. I think it was, I want to say it was polio, I can't remember. And so like they did actually give people a vaccine. They also then took their blood. And so that, you know, created a lot of vaccine skepticism in Pakistan for like a long time. We actually had a very similar issue, and I can't remember if it's in, I can't remember which African country it is, where Pfizer like had to pay out a bunch of settlements because they ran an experimental drug in that area that killed a bunch of people. And so like people were like, oh, they made the COVID vaccine? No, thank you. We will take a different one.
It was in Nigeria. I just looked it up.
Nigeria. And so like,
Oh, for
yeah.
meningitis.
Meningitis, okay, good to know. It was apparently an experimental meningitis vaccine and or treatment that killed a bunch of people. And so then, yeah, they were like, we will not be taking the Pfizer vaccine, thank y'all. And so like this sort of medical diplomacy is something that we've seen not only from like countries in the West, like the United States and Europe, we've also seen it from China. It's one of the things that has become like really prominent since COVID started, is China giving and or loaning vaccines to a bunch of like poorer countries or developing countries. Now, manufactured consent is a really important term when we talk about like the competition between liberal theories of international relations and colonial theories of international relations. Because like liberals would argue that like giving vaccines to developing nations is just a good thing. Like how can you critique that? How, like, what's wrong with you, kind of thing. Whereas colonial scholars would be like, yeah, except that then that's used as a stick to force people to take certain actions. And so this is what we call manufactured consent, where it's like, yeah, I really haven't given you any actual choices. I have just given you something and called it a choice when your choice was take this thing or die. That's not a choice. This is a critique that Marxists will levy of capitalism all the time, where it's like, well, you have all these choices, you know, when you're looking for like your health insurance. And it's like, not really though. I don't have access to most of the health insurance market. I kind of just have to use whatever my job gives me. That's manufactured consent. I have like consented to a particular plan that I never really had a choice about to begin with. And so that is where we'll get into critical literature about, say, like biotech. We need similar things for like AI. I know that Quinn is working on a book about like the way that African data is being mined illegally and often non-consensually, or sometimes under the guise of manufactured consent, which is interesting considering that like it's a mining process and that has fun parallels with like African mining processes for decades, hundreds of years even. It's just so fun. And this is why people say that the liberal narrative of progress is a little sus, because they're like, I love that we are still illegally mining things in Africa. They're just different things now. That sort of stuff. And so like those ideally are the kind of very specific links that you will be finding on this year's topic. But I'm assuming that one of the sort of default links, because this is hypothetically a very large topic. I don't think it's going to be as large as people say it's going to be. But one of the things that you can do to ensure that you always have something good and easy to fall back on is whatever your critique is. If you're cutting like a queer theory IR critique this year, you want to find queer criticisms of the liberal world order and of liberal international relations theory. That, at bare minimum, gives you at least one link in every single debate.
Can you repeat that sentence one more time? I'm sorry.
Yeah, so if whatever critique that you are thinking about running for next year, one of the things that you want to do is find critiques of liberalism from that literature base, because that will always, at bare minimum, give you a generic link to work with. Now, the Ukraine crisis gives us a bit of, it gets us into like the very sticky situation of NATO expansionism, like full throttle. Like the last time this was a really serious like discussion was in like 2008, when basically the same thing happened in Georgia, where they tried to join NATO, Russia was like absolutely not and invaded. And so.
Georgia.
I did not know they invaded Georgia.
Mm-hmm.
I did not.
What happens with that?
They kind of still own Georgia, sort of. They installed a very pro-Russian government.
Of course. Okay.
Yeah. And so that's probably what they're intending to do in Ukraine. It's just not going as well this time. And so like back then, people were like, okay, it seems like trying to expand NATO any further is actually just going to cause violent conflict. And so like maybe the liberal theory of institution building is like not always so good and correct. Whereas liberals would respond and be like, but if Georgia was part of a liberal institution that involved a security alliance, they obviously wouldn't have been attacked. That's why Russia doesn't attack NATO members. They attack them before they become NATO members. This just demonstrates that we should have more people in these kind of liberal institutions. That way they're protected. So it's a real chicken and egg thing here.
Doesn't it say like it's too late to expand?
Plot twist: Russia joins NATO.
That would be hilarious.
That is really no longer North Atlantic.
Counter plan: we allow Russia to join NATO.
I don't know what that would mean. That would be really funny.
Yeah, that'd be interesting.
It's a fun thought experiment.
If they would join, then let them in.
Well, but they would, yeah. I don't know if they would want to join them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Force Russia to join NATO. Force them
Wire
into
them
an
to
alliance.
join NATO.
Force them to join an alliance. If
Oh,
they don't want to
Lord.
be in.
Oh Lord. But yes, and so this gets us into the like core of NATO expansionism, good, bad debate, which will definitely be a big thing on the coming topic. And so we will need cards going both ways. One of the things that we'll have to be careful about in the NATO core is that there will have to be a more nuanced labeling process than just NATO is good or NATO is bad. Because NATO expansionism, good, bad, is sort of independent of the argument about whether NATO is actually good or bad. And this is an important distinction that affirmatives need to make when they are answering arguments about like Russian aggression. Is that like increasing the efficacy of the security alliance is not what has made Russia angry. It's adding members to the roster that has made Russia angry. And so as long as the affirmative doesn't add members to the roster, there's no risk that they cause a Russia conflict, that sort of stuff. Whereas the negative will need the opposite. That like NATO expansionism has gotten so out of hand that it doesn't even need to be adding new members now. Any like increase in the security alliance is going to make Russia feel threatened. Any questions about liberalism?
So the negative side will generally take the liberalism side.
Affirmative.
Or sorry, affirmative, and then the affirmative will also kind of take the realist side a little bit.
Sort of. It's like your impact scenarios are sort of like a
Yeah.
threat. Like if we don't do liberalism, then what we are left with is realism, and nobody wants that. Whereas the negative might be like, no, realism is just true, and you're just wrong.
Okay.
And that is what they're winning if they're going to win that Russia or China is revisionist, because then it doesn't matter how much institution building you're doing. They are trying to overturn the liberal world order. That's their goal. Making the liberal world order a little bit better doesn't change that goal of theirs. Whereas the negative could also then take like a much further away approach that relies on like security theory or something like that.